Welcome back to part 2 of this special blog series on Christian responses to plagues in church history. Last time, we considered how Christians made themselves notable in their care of those who underwent the Antonine Plague and the Cyprian Plague of the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. And then we also looked at Martin Luther's counsel to others about how to care for those who'd fallen sick and to try to keep oneself from getting sick and spreading the contagion as well. We're going to move forward in time now to the Puritan era in the 1600s. And the Puritans had a mix of both good and bad perspectives on pestilence. They tended to view all plagues as direct punishments from God, although I want to say that they didn't always think that way, and not all of them thought that way. The Puritans, at their worst, would see plagues as God's certain punishment on their oppressors, but at their best, they would encourage folks to rest in God's providence and care, and would give wise counsel about how to prevent the spread of disease. The issue of canceling services due to outbreaks was something that was addressed in their writings. Now, on the bad side, if a particular church saw an outbreak as God's punishment on their oppressors, then they might foolishly encourage parishioners to keep gathering, assuming that God would preserve them, and as you might imagine, this was sometimes proven to be painfully wrong counsel. But there were also some balanced perspectives to be found and appreciated amongst the Puritans. One example would be Richard Baxter, who ministered in London. He wrote a book called The Christian Directory. It was a catechism of sorts, and question 109 asks, "May we omit church assemblies on the Lord's Day if the magistrate, that is the local governor, forbid them?" The answer is, if the magistrate, for a greater good, as the common safety, forbid Christian assemblies in a time of pestilence, assault of enemies, or fire, or the like necessity, it is a duty to obey him. So here's Baxter weighing the two senses of obligation that Christians have. Obligation to obey God, first and foremost, and also an obligation to obey human authorities whom God has sovereignly put over us. And he says in a time of pestilence in particular, it is wise to follow and best to follow the civil magistrate and not to meet, and that this response would be pleasing to God. Now we come closer to our own era, the Spanish flu, which burst out in 1918 and 1920. This was the deadliest epidemic recorded in world history. The death toll estimates range from 50 million to 100 million. 500 million people were infected with the virus. That was about 1/4 of the Earth's population at that time. More American soldiers in World War I died of the Spanish flu than they did from injuries received in battle. Now, the flu came to the U.S. in March of 1918, but it really started to overwhelm things in the fall of that year. So quarantine measures were enacted across the country in different municipalities in different ways from September to November of 1918, at the first peak of the outbreak. And you can see examples of like that newspaper heading there. Schools, churches, theaters ordered closed. That was from a newspaper in Kentucky. And some churches struggle to know how to respond to this sort of thing. And the newspaper articles from October of 1918 in particular revealed headlines of most churches going along with this as a public good sort of thing and showing love to their neighbors, but some wondering whether or not this was an overreach. There were some who said that this was unconstitutional and a violation of the First Amendment. There were some who claimed that they had power over disease and that they could meet anyway. And there were some who balked at the way that the rules were inconsistently applied. One headline talked about how a pastor in Louisiana walked through town and saw that the pool hall was full of people, but he'd been told that his church could meet. And so we see some similarities in our own day, where there have been mandates that have gone out and declared some businesses essential and others non-essential. And while that general paradigm is useful, there are some instances of unevenness and some overreach. Well, in Washington, D.C., I'll focus on what happened in our nation's capital. The local Protestant leaders met and agreed to suspend services as per the mandate of the district's commissioners. Now, initially, there was some pushback amongst the churches, and some tried to do some halfway steps, like hold outdoor meetings for a time. But the severity of the outbreak grew to such a point that it eventually led to full cooperation. And I'll show you the graph from Washington, D.C. in the fall of that year. You can see how the death count spikes at the end of October and the beginning of November before it then drops down. They really did need to do something. They may have needed to have had suspensions of activities earlier to more flatten the curve as we've been talking about in our own day. So the newspapers revealed, though, how the Federation had agreed to suspend services and to prevent further outbreak, and that this was a demonstration of Christian care and concern. And so I find these studies to be enlightening. We find out that some of the things we're facing and dealing with are not new. We have more medical knowledge than previous generations, perhaps, and so the way that Christians show compassion might take a little bit of a different face. There are ways that in our own church that we're seeking to do this, to make sure that people in our church family have their physical needs met, that they have the toiletries and foods that they need. Of course, we're looking after our own family members as well. Some of our ladies are making masks. And we want to cooperate as much as we can with the civil authorities and in this time of shutdown. But also being mindful that there might be instances of overreach, and we're seeing examples of that around the country. But these are two great Christian traits that we want to emulate: compassion and cooperation, as we are waiting to meet together again. So the Lord help us to be these kind of people. The Lord help us to be wise as we're good stewards of our own health and that of our families. And let's be prayerful people that the Lord would bring an end to this time of duress and bring us back together again soon. God bless you. Thanks for watching today.